Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
In the last few episodes, we've been talking about what is wrong, what is right, how do we know the difference? Are people even wrong, or are they perfect just the way they are? If they're coming to a teacher to learn something, then there must be something that's not right, or something's wrong, or they wouldn't be there. So, can you talk a little bit more about what it means to be right? How would we define right, and how do we know if we're right?
Yes, yes, it's a very important subject, and I think it's the most different or the biggest difference that there is between what is habitually called the Alexander technique and what we teach. The initial Alexander technique is very different from the modern Alexander technique because we really do think that it's possible to notice what is wrong in an activity. And when we make that statement that something is wrong, of course, we are not assaulting the pupil. We are just stating something that we see and can be measured. That's the main difference. So there are goals. We are going to see that Alexander has constructed some procedures, and there is one that we are studying at the moment during these interviews. It's the hands on the back of a chair procedure, and we will see that this procedure has a goal. It's obvious, and it's necessary to know whether you're reaching the goal or not. And that is necessary, of course, for the teacher. The teacher must know where the pupil can improve. But it's also very, very important that the student has a clear understanding and clear guidelines about what it is we strive to achieve and what are the markers that are indicating in which way you are going. There is this idea of error detection and error correction. We think that it's not possible for the pupil to start on what we would say a virtuous path of progress if the pupil is not helped, given tools to detect errors. And if the pupil cannot detect errors, the pupil will never, in fact, really improve. The pupil may have a fantastic physical experience when he's guided by someone with the hands. I'm not discussing that. That's absolutely clear. You can get a fantastic feeling that is so different from your use that wow, yeah, you are in the midst of an experience. We are not very interested in that kind of thing because it does not lead, well, from what I've seen, to improvements. I've seen teachers practicing the hands on the back of a chair for years after years, and when you observe how they reach forward with the hands, which is the one of the purpose of the hands on the back of a chair procedure, is to teach you how to use the hands linked up with the movements of the parts of the torso. Well, when you look at it, you discover that despite the fantastic experience these teachers have had, because I know they've been trained for more than 1,600 hours, when you look at the result of senior teachers or just modern Alexander Technique teachers, well, they are not supporting the torso with the arm at all. It seems that they are striving to perform a sort of dance, but the geometry of the support of the torso is not present according to the definition Alexander has given. So uh, let's discuss this. And I did not explain the goal last time of the hands on the back of a chair, so I think it's a good place to start. And look at what Alexander is saying. Well, I have to correct that. It's not the right shape. So this is again part of the second book of Alexander. It's one of his most well, the one he appreciated the most. He thought that this was the book where more or less everything was said. And so we are discussing this chapter where I explain this procedure, that the pupil is to be taught to practice a procedure called hands on the back of a chair, with the aim of having the pupil quickly practice the hands on the back of a chair procedure on his own. So during the training, you have to train yourself in order to understand what the procedure is. The teacher is to provide experiences. So this has to be discussed, because I don't think it's a good way to present it. But for the moment, let's hear what Alexander has to say. So the teacher's aim is to give the pupil the experiences necessary to a gentle forearm pull from the fingers. And to this end, he will take hold of the pupil's elbows and direct them outwards and slightly downwards. And following this, will give the sensory experiences required in directing the upper parts of the arms above the elbow away from one another, the right arm toward the right, and the left arm toward the left, in such a way that the pupil will be supporting the torso with his arms. So the goal here is to obtain a coordination of movements where the pupil is supporting the torso with the arms. In order to achieve this goal, the pupil is, in fact, so I will describe the procedure. Here you see only one arm, but you have to imagine both arms used. The pupil is set in front of the back of a chair, represented by this green bar, and the pupil is instructed to hold the bar in between the fingers of the thumb and the opposite fingers, with the thumb and index flat on the chair, which is already something that at first is nearly impossible to obtain. It sounds so simple, but in fact it's not. In order for the index and thumb to be flat on the chair, it's absolutely necessary to widen the palm to an extent that most people cannot at first imagine. That they do not realize that the habitual use of the hand tends to really contract some flexors muscle in the palm. The adductor of the thumb is overly used all the time. And so to obtain the first geometric organization of the fingers is already difficult. Then the second consideration is that the wrist has to be directed. The movement of the wrist has to be directed so that when the elbow is going to be slightly pulled outward and downward, this is my green arrow here, we will observe that the wrist is not following the direction of the elbow. It's absolutely, it's a second requisite. It's absolutely necessary that the pupil, and at first the teacher, watch the wrist so that when the person is pulling to the elbow, or as the elbow pulled by the teacher that is using his hands, then we see that the wrist is not following the same direction of movement. This means anticipation. If you do not anticipate the pull of the elbow, if you do not think of the pull of the elbow at the same time as the movement of the wrist, at first, it's impossible to prevent the wrist from following the direction of the elbow, and the whole possibility of supporting the torso with the arm disappears, as we will see later. So, Alexander is presenting quite a complex task, and you must understand that this task has to be initiated, and the question comes that what is it? Shall we just place the fingers? Then when the fingers are placed, shall we direct the wrist? And then when the fingers and wrist are in place, are we going to direct the elbow? At first, it will be seen that trying to perfect any of the geometric consideration explained in the books will tend to make the rest of the sequence impossible or more or less incorrect. So it's necessary at that moment to realize that these procedures suggest that even before placing the fingers on the chair, so that it's possible to clearly oppose the thumb and index finger in the way presented by Alexander, it's already necessary to organize the movement simultaneously. We are not confronted with a sequence of correct or incorrect actions. It's absolutely clear that the way I teach it, very close to what is described in the books, it's necessary to understand, and the student must create a representation of what is required, not as a sequence of events following one another and each of correct one followed by a next correct one. No, it's impossible. The student is going to be confronted with a completely new task, with a level of organization that is not comparable to anything you can find in yoga or in any martial arts or sports that I know. It's how to organize a complex gesture at a high level of organization. So this is supposed to help to support the torso with the arms. And at first, that was quite surprising to me, because you're seated or standing in front of the back of a chair, and you place your hands and wrist and elbows in very detailed organization. And you're not supporting the torso with the arm. It's during all this, at first, it's the torso that is supporting the arms very clearly. And this can be seen, this can be easily measured, because when the torso is supporting the arms, and the procedure can be, a lengthy procedure, you will find that the pupil will have a tendency to use the muscle of the shoulder a bit too much, so that you will see the shoulder raising in the air above the ribs. There are many ways this can be, in fact, shown to the pupil when it happens, how it happens, and how it is measured. So I use geometry all the time. And so we are going to use geometry first to understand what it is, what do we mean by supporting the torso with the arms. So the sequence is very interesting. Alexander is using what is called a closed kinematic system. We know it's closed because we are requested to pull on a bar, to pull on the back of the chair with the fingers, and we are requested to maintain and some people would say fixate the wrist in a certain direction. Of course, we must think of a movement of the wrist resisting another movement, an antagonistic movement. The wrist is set to go downward and inward, while the elbow is said to be going, outwards and slightly downwards. So when this is happening, I discovered that, in fact, the reason for the whole procedure is to discover that when we can orientate the movements of the wrist and elbow, suddenly we get an effect in the torso, an effect in the back. So this is the start of the procedure. I want you to understand that the mechanism of the arm is here depicted as 3 linked in a chain. So the chain is closed in a sense that the hand is supposed not to move, to stay exactly where it is on the back of the chair. But also, there is another linked that is supposed not to move, you will see that at first, when you ask the pupil to pull the elbow outward and slightly downward when the hand is fixed on the chair, then there is a tendency for the rib cage to move with the arms. This is very obvious when the pupil is only using one hand to start with. It's easier to use one hand than two, and it's to start learning the procedure, it's absolutely accepted that the pupil could start using one hand on the back of a chair and start to get the effect we are looking for. So in that case, well, it's quite common that when the elbow is moved outward, considering the habitual shortening of the muscle that connect the shoulder blade to the head, we can see that immediately when you start pulling on the elbow, or when the pupil starts pulling on the elbow, there is either a tendency of the movement of the neck or a tendency directly of the movement of the torso that is attached to it. So we start having a pull, and when you have a pull with two opposite fixed ends, suddenly what you will notice in between these two images, there is, of course, a movement of the shoulder blade. The shoulder blade is, of course, moving along the rib cage. And something happens then, you discover that it's suddenly possible for the pupil to wear the shoulders further away from the spine. So the first thing you will notice when you start practicing this procedure is that it's suddenly possible to widen the back in such a way that you're not closing down on the front, but that you're opening the front as well. This we are discussing widening the upper torso. It's suddenly obvious that there is a completely new shape at the upper part of the back. And so this, at first, will lead to a very different tension in, of course, the tissues, the fascias, elastic ligaments, and even muscles of the back and front of the torso. But why is that considered to be, in a certain way, supporting the torso? Well, you can imagine first that the support of the torso is understood in the, well, the negative sense, if you want, is that now we have much more elastic connections between the arm and the torso. So in the first image, what you will see is that the shoulder blade is very close to the spine. So it means that the shoulder blade is resting on very short ribs. The higher ribs, the ribs that are closest to the first, to the top of the sternum, if you want, are very, it's not even represented here. They are very narrow. And so at first, when the person is shortening the muscles of the neck, shortening the trapezius muscle in particular, you will find that the shoulder blade is sticking outward and it's very high. The person wears the shoulders nearly at the height of the top of the sternum or even higher. When that is the case, the back is narrowing completely, so it's something visible. So there is a marked change in the bony structure of the back when the neck is shortened. But as soon as you start pulling on the elbow, you must understand that, of course, the wrist may turn, but the wrist is not to move. It's not to, well, be pulled very far away from the hand. It's going to stay there. But what will happen is that the portion of the mechanism that is going to, well, be submitted to the greatest pull is the shoulder blade. And the shoulder blade will start to move outwards and further outwards as time goes on. Because at first, for the pupil, it creates so much tension, so much inhabitual tension, that the pupil is going to react by thinking that this is incorrect, this cannot be right. There is most students or teachers that are having lessons with me at first, when they start practicing the hands on the back of a chair in the geometric way that I teach, at first they say, but it's really, I've got a pain. It's really pulling. It's really, and so this is correct. This is absolutely true. The pupil is not used to having the shoulder very far away from the spine. The pupil has all the habits possible to, in fact, raise the shoulders toward the head. And suddenly to discover that, well, something different is possible is associated with tension. There is what we call due tension. Appropriate tension is a tension the pupil is not used to. This is true for, of course, the neck, but it's also the case that the forearm is going to be submitted to a very strong mechanical pull. And so the fascia under that are, well, you must understand that the muscles that are controlling the fingers have a belly that is very close to the elbow. And so the muscle of the hands that are necessary to hold the chair are not in the hand or in the wrist. It's all the tendons that are passing through the wrist. And so for the pupil at first, they are used to having very thick tendon. And thick tendons, you must understand, they are passing through like tubes, sheath of fascia, and if they have been used with too much shortening for many years, at first you must understand that these structures have a capacity to create unwanted bonds. We call them adhesions. Many people have a wrist problem. They will understand what I mean by fascial adhesions. And at first, when you start playing with this very strong procedure, very strong geometrical procedure, at first, well, these adhesions will break. You will break the adhesion by pulling onto the elbow. It's absolutely obvious. And so at first, it's a surprise that a procedure that is supposed to be rehabilitation, a nice, gentle pull on the elbow could produce such tears, such, well, unpleasant tensions. But the pupil will understand, because when the pupil will discover on screen what I'm showing you here is that there are very clear geometrical changes. The pupil will see and will be requested to watch the video and to observe that, yes, there are difficult experiences, in the sense that we don't like to feel tensions or tear of adhesions. But these tear of adhesions are necessary, and the pupil will realize that, yes, there is a marked change in the shape of the upper torso, but also of the middle torso. And this will lead us to start to understand what Alexander means by this support of the torso with the arms. The explanation lies in the geometry and the way the mechanism of the arm is linked with the back. On these pictures, what you see is on the right, Alexander is showing a pupil performing the hands of the back of a chair procedure. We can see that with his right hand, he is helping the pupil widen the upper part of the arm away from one another. And because of the width of the shoulder blades are now invisible. There is no protruding bone anywhere. You see the shoulder blades has moved totally to the side of the rib cage, and as a result, the rib cage itself is not supporting the arm anymore. The difficulty with the mechanism of the arm is that very, very often the person will be using the arm And the shoulder blades are going to be very near the first ribs. So the weight of the arm is pressing down on the rib cage. And so when the person uses the arm, you will see, in fact, that the rib cage is subjected to the weight of the arm. If you pull only on one side, I explained that it's possible to practice the hands on the back of the chair with one arm, then you will find that the person has a tendency to lean down or even to try and pull the head away to maintain the rib cage in place despite the pressing down of the arm. When the arms are moving outwards sufficiently, as is seen on this picture, there is a visible sign that suddenly the rib cage is first free of the weight of the arm. That is the fall of the shoulder line. On this picture, what you see is that the shoulder blade is very far out, the arm is down, but not the rib cage. The upper ribs and the sternum must be very high to get that fall of the shoulder. This is, for the pupil, a sign that the conditions for supporting the torso with the arms exist, because, first of all, the arms are not pressing down on the rib cage. There is now the possibility of a freedom of movement of the rib cage emerging in between the upper arms. The upper arms are going away from one another. That is what is requested in Alexander's description. But they are going apart from one another in order to allow for the ribs to be free of the weight of the arms. The first support is the freedom of the rib cage from the arms. And then there is another action that is going to be seen, is that when suddenly the shoulder blades are going outwards, then the widest muscle in the back, which is the Latissimus Dorsi, the muscle that is represented here, that is attached just under the arm, this muscle is starting to go forward and downward away from the middle torso, which means that you can see here that Alexander is starting to use the mechanism of the arm in order to stretch the thoracolumbar fascia. And there is one image, some of my students, they really like it. It's the image that shows that it's possible to use the mechanism of the arm. You have the monkey brachiation that is represented just above to remind people that when we press down with the arms, you must understand that in order to lift his torso, the monkey must make an action of the arm directed downwards. The movement downwards is powered by the greatest muscle of the back, the Latissimus Dorsi. And in this way, the Latissimus Dorsi is pulling the middle spring of the back, the thoracolumbar fascia, the enormous fascia of the back. It's in fact stretching it. When you stretch the fascia, of course, this fascia will respond in kind by augmenting the resistance, augmenting the elastic resistance. So as you make one movement to direct the elbow outward and downward, which is going forward for the arm, you're going forward away from the back, and the back is going away from the arm. As you can see, there is a neat necessity to understand that the arms is going forward and the back is going back. When that is happening, this enormous fascia is suddenly stretched and its pull is bidirectional, meaning that the more you widen, the more you get a vertical resistance. So you can use then the full weight of the head, shoulder, and arms forward while the middle torso is going back, and you get a fantastic cantilever that is producing an antagonistic pull that will support the torso. The torso is supported by the antagonistic pull between the mechanism of the arm going forward and down and the mechanism of the back going backward and upward. So, therefore, you get what we call supporting the torso with the arms. It's an experience, but at first, the pupil will not get the experience unless he can, well, create a representation of what it is we are looking for. As I said, I compare here two images. One student that is working with me, and I've taken a picture from the net, from the internet, where you see a modern Alexander Technique teacher, and there is a marked difference. What I see here is that the mechanism of the arm is supported by the torso. And this is obvious because the back is arched, because the upper part of the torso is pulled backward. This conduces to supporting the arm with the torso. The arms are like a dead weight pressing down on the torso, and the person is protruding the abdomen and pulling the upper torso backward in order to support that weight. As a result, we have the straight neck, picture. That is habitual. We can see that if you draw the line of the lower lumbar region, you will find that the head is very, very far back relative to it when you compare with somebody that is opposing the movement of the mechanism of the torso to the movement of the arms. So we discover more and more that, there is a reality between supporting the torso with the arms. And this reality is not just a simple pushing down on the chair. The large lifting muscle of the back, that's what Alexander is explaining. He says that the teacher so adjusts the torso that the large lifting muscle of the back will be employed coordinately with the other parts of the organism in bringing about such use of the respiratory mechanism that they will function to the maximum at the particular stage of development reached from day to day. Most people, when reading this, cannot connect in any way the support with the breathing. It makes very little sense at first if you do not represent what is sought, what is the geometric condition that will lead for the muscle, the largest muscle of the back, to in fact lift the rib cage from above. Because what the Latissimus Dorsi is doing, most people think of the Latissimus Dorsi, that this large muscle of the back, they think about it as a muscle that is used to pull the arm down. Yes, that's correct. You can see that the origin of that muscle is the torso, and obviously when this muscle is active, well, of course, it's pulling the arm down. If the arm was not pulled down, the middle torso will go immediately below the supporting hand. The one moment is very important to understand. It's the moment of the swinging. When the ape is passing from one branch to the other one. You must understand that the Latissimus Dorsi action, when it's active, when it's really working and not released. If you imagine if the monkey was to release the Latissimus Dorsi at the moment of swinging, you would not see this movement. You would not see, the axis of the monkey so far away from the supporting hand. You would see the axis exactly in line with it. The Latissimus Dorsi is allowing the central axis to be directed purposefully away from the supporting limb. You are going to see exactly the same thing when we do walking. It's not the same limb, but it's exactly the same idea. Most people, in taking a step, have a tendency to completely forget about the central axis direction, and they hold their weight above the supporting foot. As a result, they collapse the spine every time without absolutely knowing nothing about it. There we see the principle in action. It's possible to, in fact, use the mechanism of the arm or the mechanism of the legs in order to support the back, which means supporting the central axis. Supporting the central axis is maintaining the central axis away from the supporting limb. So, supporting the central axis, does it make any sense in bringing the use of the respiratory mechanism that we want, instead of having the lower rib cage expanded forward with a protruding abdomen? We see that it's possible to oppose the movement of the back to the movement of the limbs, and in such a way, well, supporting the torso with the arm means expanding the torso with the arm. Alexander says success in this part of the evolution will bring about a change in the condition of the back, which would be described by the ordinary observer as a widening of the back. When the back goes back relatively to the arms, the back is seen to widen. It's obvious. When the back is going forward, relatively to the arm and upper torso, you are expanding the front, not the back. This is what I call narrowing the middle back. And it's a geometrical measurement. It's not some sort of feeling that a teacher has and says to you, oh, I feel that you're widening. No, it's an objective measurement, and it's possible for the pupil to assess that change, to assess the geometrical transformation, and to exactly understand how the geometric measurement is modified. There is not, as I said before, the detection of the error, I said, was very important. Yes, but what is very, very important is to understand the direction of the correction and the capacity for the pupil to assess it on his own without the teacher hands being there. This comes to a very clear difference between conscious guidance and somatic guidance. In the modern Alexander technique, the specialist touch teacher who has been trained for 3 years to develop a completely new sense of feeling, and becomes the teacher who is telling the pupil what is wrong. He's telling the pupil that he's pulling down. But the pupil has not developed the same qualitative touch, and so the pupils must rely on the teacher to know what is wrong with him, or what is doing wrong, or what is not inhibiting. This leads to great difficulty in the modern Alexander technique. Many times I've heard students in different schools telling that their teachers had, decreted that they could not be qualified immediately, that they had to do another term or 2 terms before reaching a certain level, but that level was always judged by the individual with his special sense of touch. There is no objective consideration. Why is it that the pupil is not succeeding? How is the pupil not succeeding? What I wanted an objective way to make sure that if the pupil hears a comment on his practice, on his way of performing the procedure, he could evaluate the teacher, evaluate the comment of the teacher. Otherwise, it all comes down to personalities. If the teacher likes you, you're going to be qualified early. If the teacher does not like you, well, There is no way to evaluate how you're going to be judged. And people are judged. When it's time to give leave to a student with a qualification, of course you're judging people. So I thought that it was suddenly for me a great relief to discover that in fact Alexander describes a procedure where it's not a special person that is feeling something that no one else can feel, that is making the judgment or basing the judgment on something is felt. No, we want to see that market change in the back. We want to see it, and from there, well, you will find that there are many ways where success can be assessed not by the teacher, but by the pupil herself. So we continue, and the pupil is now asked to continue to support the torso in this way, continuing to rehearse his orders, while the teacher so adjusts the torso that the large lifting muscle of the back will be employed coordinately with the other part of the organism. The success in this part is not something that will arrive immediately. There are impeding conditions, and they are apt to occur at the pupil's first attempt to pull gently with the arms. So we are back in front of our chair. We are holding the chair with the requisite position of the fingers, of the wrist and of the elbows. We are supposing that the hands are pulling on the chair. When you pull the elbow, it's like if you were wanting to widen the chair or to make the bar, the rail, lengthen in between your hands. So there is a real pull that is applied by the fingers on the chair through the pull of the elbows. Alexander explained that there are impeding conditions. It's a strange thing to say. It's something wrong is happening. He says that in his attempt to do this, either one or the other of all the fingers will become bent and the wrist will be curved inward. Exactly the reverse of the action indicated by the orders or of the one desired. The failure to carry out the given orders is due chiefly to the fact that the pupil's sensory appreciation is in the matter of due and proper muscular tension is sadly inadequate. When I see this sentence or sentences, there are 3 sentences, I see in fact 3 markers of the existence of a true technique. The term technique means art of construction. So you're supposed to become capable of performing complex or skilled performance. When you have to direct at least 3 joints at the same time, which is the joints of the finger, the joint of the elbow, the joint of the shoulder, you're involved in skill performance. And you have to understand that, as you will see, Alexander is pointing to difficulties because we are discussing a very complex act. So, 3 markers of the existence of the true technique. Well, the first one is discovering that, of course, we are asking something of the pupil. Very often in the modern Alexander technique, the pupil responsibility is taken away from him. It's the teacher that is going to produce the new organization. In the initial Alexander technique and in the technique as I teach it, of course, I'm always requesting the pupil to perform a series of complex action, and we are evaluating the results. So here we see that the pupil has to attempt to pull gently with the arms. The teacher is providing some experience of the pools, fine, but why? Well, the reason why is that we do want that the pupil experiment with this pool of the arm. We want the pupil to discover that it's obviously possible to direct the mechanism of the arm in such a way that the elbow direction of movement is consciously performed, is consciously planned, is consciously directed. That in the situation that we have discussed, of course, you ask the pupil to direct the tip of the elbow outward. So outward is the direction away from the center of the body, and downward, well, is a direction that is parallel to the plane of the torso. So the pupil is really requested to move the elbow in a certain direction. At first, very often the pupils say, but I have no idea how to do what you're requesting of me. The pupil has never, or the pupil will perform an action and looking at it and looking at the video recording of that sequence, we can say to the pupil that the elbow has not been pulled outward and downward. That there was no outward motion that was visible. If there is a movement outward, the distance between the, hear me correctly, the horizontal distance between the wrist and the elbow must increase. Geometrically, this is only possible if suddenly the pupil allows the back to widen. The pupil does not know that he tends to resist, and that at first he doesn't know that his habitual use or how we wear the shoulders is really in fact within very, very narrow limits, that the pupil immediately will feel some sort of pull in the neck and shoulder, and immediately the pupil will stop any movement with the elbow. But more movement is possible, and more movement is requested. So very often we have to, well, ask the pupil to perform other type of movements for the pupil to realize that in fact is limiting his range of movement, that more movement is possible with the elbow than he thought. And I'm talking here about people that have been trained in the somatic system, and that are supposed to feel, to know, well, the expression that I hear very often, I know my body. Most people know their feelings, yes, but their feelings are only describing the movement they are performing most of the time. If suddenly you create very, very strict conditions, like in the hands on the back of a chair, then suddenly you are asked to explore beyond your habitual movements, and the teacher that knows his body suddenly discovers that, well, he knows his body within his habits of movements. It's very possible that there is another range of movement that has been hidden to her because of the feeling, the sensory appreciation of tension. That the person has lived with a sense of what is proper tension for the shoulders. And if the person is used to releasing, the person will not at first accept or recognize the possibility of movement that exceed that feeling of release. One thing about the hands on back of a chair procedure is this new realization that Alexander is sometimes talking about release, but very often he's talking about the proper tension. What is the proper tension in the mechanism of the arm. And that is very interesting. When he say the pupil's sensor appreciation in the matter of due and proper muscular tension is sadly inadequate. Due and proper tension is tension. Due and proper tension is not a feeling of release. It cannot be. So we have seen the first point, the first marker is this marker is that pull gently with the arms. I would recommend people to put a question mark about the gently. You know, it depends on your experience. For some people, this is not going to apply. It's not gentle at all. It's determined. It's the initiative of going where you have not been before. The initiative of going past your habitual feeling, and gentle does not work. Maybe it worked for Alexander, but most of my students, when they work on the hands on the back of a chair, they discover suddenly some new tension in the hand. Well, to get the width of the hand that is requested in the hands on the back of a chair geometry, at first it's as if you have something in your hand that does not want to give. And no matter how much you will yourself to let it go, and you will find that at first it's like an enormous spring that is at the moment not doing what you want, and that it's possible with some work and with the initiative and intention to create the pool. Then it's possible to gain after some work. Now, we have discussed the pupil's attempt. Now, the second part, we discovered that there are actions that are indicated by the orders. The orders are not orders of release. You do not release the elbow outward and downward. I've never seen it work. It's an action. You really want to see a rectilinear motion of the elbow, and this can only be obtained if you are very clear on the action you want to see happen. Staying with the hands on the back of a chair for hours without action makes absolute no sense. There will be no action, and because there is no order. And so the new orders are absolutely necessary here, so that when you start pulling on the elbow, the fingers are staying in place, staying directed downward, straight downward, and the palm is continuing to expand. And so here it's necessary to construct models that are possible to direct with your head, with your mind. And so that's what I wanted to have at my disposition and the disposition of my students. So for example, I'm showing here the kind of model that we use. So you can see, well, it's a left hand seen from below, so you are seeing the palm. But what you see is, in fact, just a representation of the bony parts. And when I work with my students, there are very important markers of what hands on the back of a chair is about. We see that we can easily locate some anatomical landmarks. So we have the base of the palm that is going to help us direct the wrist. You remember that in the procedure, it's absolutely necessary when the elbows goes out that the wrist does not follow. And so you can see a spot here. And that spot is very clearly indicated. And so the person that is, of course, watching his hands during the procedure will see how it's possible suddenly to get two opposite actions. We are discussing actions because when you pull the elbow outward and downwards, at first, exactly as Alexander explained, the pupil cannot, in fact, maintain the wrist direction. I'm discussing a direction of movement because there is a direction of movement on the elbow, and if you don't want to see an unwanted movement, that the one that is that Alexander is describing, where the wrist is starting to curve outward, if you want to continue to see the wrist curve inward, you must, in fact, in your mind, have an intention of movement. It's not an intention of staying in place. An intention of staying in place is never going to oppose the movement of the elbow. No, you must understand that you must modulate how you pull the elbow and how you pull the wrist in order to be capable of continuing to direct the elbow along a rectilinear line, a real action that is going to be filmed, while the elbow does not brings with it the wrist. So you can continue with a close-linked system and in that way make absolutely certain that you are starting to pull on the Latissimus Dorsi. Yes, the Latissimus Dorsi is attached just in front of the top of the humerus. So it runs from the front of the humerus, below the arm, and right down to the middle of the back. And so when you are pulling the tip of the elbows outward, you must understand that we are discussing a simple geometry. If the humerus is able to move forward and to move outward, well, you must realize that suddenly you're applying a great pull on the Latissimus Dorsi, the great lifter of the back. That's how Alexander describes the muscle, the great lifter of the back. Well, you must understand that in this case, we are discussing supporting the torso with the arms, where suddenly the direction of action of the movement of the parts is starting to widen the back. And also, something else must come to your mind now, is that as you're pulling the, of course, upper arm forward, pulling the shoulder blades forward, well, you are applying a forward motion on the upper torso. And it's necessary to understand that this, well, will not happen without consequence for the torso. If, when you pull the tip of the elbow outward, you are not at first thinking of the torso. We are thinking of the elbows. Well, without your knowledge, without you knowing it, it's not at all the picture that you see. If you look at what happens is between the images, you may notice that the torso is moving. The torso has to be moved backward. The torso is moving backward in between each images, because if the middle torso is not pulled back, well, the arm is going to bring the torso forward. It's a simple mechanical system. If you pull the elbow outward, you've got two links. Well, of course, you're pulling forward. You're pulling the torso forward. If there is no pull backward, well, you will see the pupil leaning more and more. So the pupil can be told about this and can be told to expect a pull on the upper torso by using the mechanism of the arm. We agree for the mechanism of the upper torso to move forward, but we want the pupil to understand that it's possible to oppose the middle torso to the mechanism of the arm. When I was showing these images, this pupil on the right is opposing the movement of the elbows that is pulling the upper torso forward to the middle torso that is pulling back and upward. And you must understand that this is just logic. It's just impossible not to really widen the upper part of the arm and start to lengthen the mechanism, the largest muscle of the back, without opposing the movement of the back. Otherwise, the movement of the back is going to move forward, exactly as in this picture on the left. So The somatic guidance has nothing to say about this. The person is just performing an act and feels that he's leaning correctly. In reason guidance, it's completely different. The person is absolutely conscious of the consequences of actions. And if these consequences are not anticipated, well, if there is no conscious guidance, it's impossible to get the opposition between the back and the upper torso. So Alexander is giving us this notion that we are to use the orders as guide for actions. And we request the pupil to work with a complex mechanism where each action must be met by an opposite action, otherwise the geometry is going to fail. So this procedure is very, very useful for the pupil to understand where is the failure. The failure is not in the feeling. The failure is in the first incapacity of the person to organize intentions of movement, organize the series of intentions. As I said to start, when I started, I said that we are not discussing a sequence of actions one after the other and looking which action is incorrect. No, we are looking at a series of actions that have to occur all at the same time. And so this is what the technique is about. The conscious guidance technique is about the capacity to obey a series of simultaneous intentions. And that will make the last part a bit more tangible. Alexander is saying that the failure to carry out the given orders is due chiefly to the fact that the pupil's sensory appreciation in the matter of due and proper muscular tension is sadly inadequate. It's necessary to revisit this statement. Why is the pupil failing? What is the cause of the failure? Yes, because the pupil is going to feel the result of actions. The pupil is likely to forget about the series of intentions that he had to follow. The failure is not in the sensory appreciation. The sensory appreciation is a stimulus for the pupil, a very strong stimulus at first. The pupil is always checking his feelings to know whether he's right or wrong. Here, we see that this is the main problem. It's because the pupil is feeling what he's doing that he forgets that he's involved in a very complex and structured activity where if he focuses on one thing that he feels, that's it. It's failed. We will see that all the other intentions are going to fade in the feeling of one thing, and the pupil is not going to be capable of maintaining the orientation of the general activity. So the failure to carry out the given orders comes from the fact that the pupil feels too much. And in fact tends to focus his mind on feeling. And when you focus your mind, you cannot have your mind on a series of orders all together. That's the main difficulty. So the pupil is taught to attempt the pulls by himself. That's the first point. The second point, he must obey the actions indicated by the orders. He must obey the series of actions indicated by the orders. And the third point, he must learn to appreciate the due and proper muscular tension, but just in order to be capable of continuing to obey the actions indicated by the orders. And that is not possible if he forgets the actions indicated by the orders because he's feeling pull somewhere, or he's feeling that there is not enough pull somewhere. If you understand now the hands and back of the chair procedure as we think them in the initial Alexander technique, we are not discussing just the position of the parts of the hands or the position of the parts of the hands relatively to the wrist or relatively to the elbow. No, we are thinking of the relationship between the mechanism of the arm and the mechanism of the torso. And if you forget just half of a second any of it, well, immediately the camera is going to register faults. This is great because this gives us a very good lesson for the directing mind. The lesson is not for the person to learn what it is to feel right when doing the performance. No, suddenly the feeling during the performance completely loses attraction, completely loses meaning. It's not the feeling that you get during the practice that is going to help you, in fact, improve your understanding, improve your capacity to obey orders, improve your capacity to maintain the orders, as many as they are, during a performance. This is the view of the central procedure described by Alexander in constructive conscious control. Questions?
Yeah, well, just a comment, really. The image you showed there of FM Alexander with one of his early pupils, the black and white image, you can really see the widening of the back. So this phrase "widen the back" and "widening the back" gets used a lot, but it's very visually striking when you see it, when you see the back widened. And it's never clear what part of the back. So I think a lot of people focus on the lower back, but the upper back is also extremely wide, because when you have the arms, the elbows out, forward and down like this, the shoulder blades come apart, and if you see someone from behind, they're much wider at the back, at the upper back as well. So I think the people just a lot of people haven't defined what they mean by widening the back very well, or try to figure out what Alexander actually meant. Because as he says there, it's if somebody's an observer, will see it, will describe it as widening the back. It's not a feeling.
Yes, exact. And once you start to understand the mechanics, the geometry of that mechanics, well, you know exactly when and how you could go there. Because it's all nice to have people say, I feel that you're widening the back. Yes, but this is a judgment. This is just an opinion. You have a feeling that the person is widening the back.
And most of the times you see someone standing with their hands in the back of the chair, their lower back will be slightly curved inward. It isn't widened and flat like you'll see in that image of the early person.
Absolutely.
And that's obviously the reason of having the arms and the hands on the back of the chair, is to get to create this geometry.
Exactly.
So in other words, all you're doing then is just standing in a position and holding a position. You're not actually, as you said earlier, it's not actions, it's not decisions of movements.
Yeah. Yes, the main thing is we want to make absolutely clear for the pupil that his capacity to direct actions, to direct simultaneous intention of movements or simultaneous action, is the central part. The physicality of it is not interesting. But then you must also understand that while you are widening the back and lengthening the back in the way that is shown on the black and white picture, you're starting a very strong action of the mind upon the body. And it's not the body upon the mind. Absolutely not. That's what I discovered reading Alexander. He's not interested in... You may think that because the teacher is adjusting the pupil, that is interested in communicating a physical experience that will reach the mind. I do not understand the conscious guidance and control system in this way at all. All the opposite. All my lessons are dedicated to making the pupil realize that it's by organizing very clear instructions that describe complex action, occurring at the same time. They are complex, but they can be very well defined in space and time. And so the pupil will start to discover that he can explore beyond his physicality, his habitual habits, and discover new things. So it's really a question of mind over matter, mind over physicality, and not the opposite. This explains why I am such well, an anti-somatic teacher.
Excellent. Exactly. So for people watching the video, if you go underneath, there's a link to Jeando where you can book a lesson with him and enjoy some anti-somaticism. And we will see you in the next video. Thanks, Jeando.
Thank you, Kevin. Bye.